The wind speaks in ancient tongues against the lighthouse walls, its voice carrying across waters that have turned to hammered pewter beneath a sky the color of old bones. Christmas Eve descends upon the North Atlantic coast, like a prayer whispered into darkness, snow falling in thick curtains that blur the boundary between sea and sky until the world becomes nothing but white motion and the steady pulse of light that cuts through winter's throat like a blade of fire. Keeper Elias Ward climbs the spiral stairs with movements that have grown deliberate over 7 decades of life, each step echoing in the tower's hollow core with sounds that speak of solitude made manifest in stone and iron. At 70 years, his body carries the accumulated weight of 42 winters spent tending this beacon that stands sentinel over waters where ships have learned to fear the marriage of storm and stone. His hands marked by countless encounters with frozen metal and oil that burns with the persistence of devotion itself. The lantern room waits at the tower's crown like a cathedral of glass and brass, its great Fresnel lens gathering what little daylight remains and transforming it into something approaching divine radiance that reaches across miles of churning water, to touch vessels that fight their way through seas that show no mercy to human ambition or need. Here, surrounded by mechanisms that breathe with mechanical precision, Elias performs the rituals that have defined his existence since the day he first accepted responsibility for maintaining this light that stands between safe harbor and the hungry darkness that swallows ships whole. The oil reservoir requires attention that has become second nature, his weathered fingers checking levels and adjusting wicks with movements that bypass conscious thought, to operate through understanding accumulated across decades of identical nights when duty demanded presence despite personal comfort or individual desire. The flame that burns within the lamp's heart consumes fuel with appetite that never varies, regardless of weather conditions or seasonal changes, regardless of whether ships depend upon its guidance, or whether the sea stretches empty to horizons that hold no trace of human passage. Ice has formed again on the lens assembly, crystalline formations that scatter light in directions that serve beauty rather than navigation, forcing Elias to chip away frozen deposits with tools designed for delicate work among components whose precision tolerances admit no compromise with atmospheric conditions that treat mechanical devices as enemies to be conquered through persistent assault. Each fragment that falls carries the sound of winter's retreat, temporary victories in a war that will resume with the next storm, the next drop in temperature that transforms moisture into barriers that must be overcome through patience and careful application of heat, that melts obstacles without damaging surfaces that focus light according to mathematical principles that connect earthly craft to cosmic geometry. The logbook waits on its wooden stand, pages yellow with age and spotted with oil stains that mark entries made during storms when steady hands became luxuries that weather refused to provide. Tonight's record will note wind direction and estimated velocity, visibility conditions that affect ships' ability to navigate by visual reference points, temperature readings that speak of winter's grip tightening around this promontory where land meets water in eternal conflict that creates beauty and danger in equal measure. Yet the words that flow from his pen carry weight beyond meteorological data, observations that document not merely atmospheric conditions, but the quality of solitude that deepens with each passing season. Christmas Eve, he writes in script that has grown more careful with age, letters formed with deliberation that transforms writing into meditation upon time's passage and meaning's persistence. Despite circumstances that might seem designed to erode human significance, until individual existence becomes indistinguishable from natural phenomena that operate according to principles larger than personal understanding can encompass. 42nd season at this station. Wind northeast, strong and steady. Snow heavy, visibility poor. Ships advised to seek shelter until conditions improve. The entry complete. He sets the pen aside and moves to the window that faces seaward, where darkness has settled over waters that roll with power, that makes human engineering appear fragile as paper boats launched by children who have not yet learned to fear the forces that their toys must navigate. The storm builds with patience that speaks of natural processes that measure time in geological rather than human scales. Waves growing larger as wind gathers strength that will test every structure that dares to interrupt the ocean's conversation with the sky. Through glass made thick enough to withstand pressures that would shatter ordinary windows, Elias observes patterns of foam and spray that create temporary sculptures against rocks that have stood since continents took their present positions. Geological artwork that appears and dissolves according to rhythms that connect this moment to countless others when water and stone have negotiated boundaries through violence that creates beauty while destroying everything that lacks sufficient strength to endure encounters with forces that recognize no authority beyond their own momentum. The lighthouse beam sweeps across this theater of natural drama with mechanical regularity that contrasts with chaotic movements of elements that respond to pressures too complex for human prediction, despite centuries of observation that have revealed patterns within apparent randomness. Each rotation illuminates scenes that exist for seconds before darkness reclaims them, brief revelations of a world that continues its ancient activities regardless of whether human consciousness witnesses their unfolding or records their significance in documents that preserve observations for generations that may possess different understanding of what such records contain. Memory carries him backward through decades of similar nights, when storm and solitude combined to create conditions that stripped away distractions until consciousness faced itself without interference from social obligations or professional demands that normally prevented the kind of sustained introspection that revealed how individual existence related to larger patterns of meaning that connected personal experience to cosmic purposes that operated through human lives without requiring human comprehension for their successful completion. Sarah's face appears in lamplight that flickers against glass surfaces made uneven by manufacturing processes that created optical effects impossible to achieve through modern precision. Her features composed of shadows and reflections that memory supplies with details that time has made more vivid rather than less distinct. 23 years since consumption claimed her before their planned wedding could unite lives that had discovered in each other completion, that neither had imagined possible during separate existences that had seemed adequate until love revealed how much had been missing from arrangements that mistook survival for flourishing. Her death had driven him to this isolation that promised escape from reminders that populated every street and building in towns, where their courtship had created associations too painful to endure without defenses that distance alone could provide. The lighthouse keeper position had offered employment that required skills he possessed, while providing geographical and social separation from environments that triggered grief too intense for conscious management. Solitude that allowed mourning to proceed according to natural rhythms, rather than social expectations that demanded recovery according to schedules that ignored the actual duration required for hearts to heal from wounds that cut deeper than surface damage. Yet isolation had revealed that memory travels without regard for physical boundaries, that love persists beyond biological termination through mechanisms that operate independently of conscious will or geographical location. Sarah's presence had followed him to this tower where conversations continued despite her physical absence, where decisions remained collaborative despite his apparent solitude, where Christmas Eve carried significance derived from plans they had made for celebrating. Together seasons that death had separated into different categories of experience that maintained connection through means that rational explanation could not adequately describe, yet daily experience confirmed through evidence that accumulated beyond possibility of dismissal as mere imagination. The lens mechanism requires winding that maintains rotation speed within tolerances that ensure proper timing for navigation aids, that depend upon predictable intervals between light pulses, that create signatures unique to each beacon along coastlines, where multiple lighthouses might otherwise create confusion for mariners who depend upon accurate identification of their position relative to known hazards and safe passages. The clockwork that governs this rotation operates through principles that connect mechanical precision to human survival through engineering, that translates abstract mathematical relationships into physical devices that serve practical purposes while embodying intellectual achievements that represent centuries of accumulated knowledge about relationships between theoretical understanding and applied technology. The brass gears respond to adjustment with sounds that speak of metal surfaces worn smooth through friction that has polished away roughness, while preserving essential dimensional relationships that determine functional accuracy. Each tooth engages its corresponding surface according to specifications that allow no variation beyond microscopic tolerances that affect timing relationships, with consequences that extend far beyond this tower to encompass ships whose navigation depends upon signals that must arrive at predicted intervals to provide reliable reference points for calculations that determine whether courses lead towards safe harbor or dangerous proximity to obstacles that destroy vessels whose crews trust beacons to guide them through waters where visual landmarks disappear beneath weather conditions that reduce visibility to distances measured in yards rather than miles. The storm intensifies as night deepens, wind velocity increasing until the tower itself vibrates with resonant frequencies that connect structural engineering to acoustic phenomena that create music from materials never intended for artistic expression. The sound penetrates stone and metal to reach human consciousness as reminder of forces that dwarf individual significance while simultaneously depending upon individual dedication for responses that serve purposes larger than personal survival, yet remain impossible to achieve without personal commitment that transcends rational motivation, to touch realms where duty becomes expression of love that operates independently of expected reciprocity or public recognition. Christmas Eve had once promised celebration that connected personal happiness to seasonal rhythms that acknowledged divine intervention in human affairs through incarnation, that made cosmic love accessible to earthly experience through historical events that provided foundation for hope, that extended beyond individual mortality to encompass possibilities for meaning that survived biological termination. Now the holiday carries weight that speaks of absence rather than presence, of traditions interrupted rather than fulfilled, of love that persists despite circumstances that seem designed to test whether human attachment can survive separation that appears final according to physical evidence, yet remains incomplete according to emotional experience that recognizes continuity where reason detects only conclusion. The oil flame burns with steady brightness that creates sphere of warmth within glass housing that protects combustion from wind that would extinguish ordinary fires, yet cannot penetrate defenses that human engineering has created through understanding of aerodynamic principles that redirect destructive forces into patterns that actually improve performance by creating draft conditions that enhance rather than diminish the chemical processes that convert fuel into light through oxidation, that requires precise balance between air supply and combustible material to achieve optimal efficiency. Standing before mechanisms that operate with reliability that human consistency rarely matches, Elias contemplates how individual lives serve purposes that extend beyond personal satisfaction, to connect human effort to cosmic order, through activities that honor divine creativity, while serving practical needs that ensure community survival and cultural continuity across generations, that face different challenges while sharing fundamental requirements for guidance through darkness, that threatens to overwhelm consciousness with doubt about meaning and purpose, that make existence valuable beyond mere biological persistence. The beacon's light reaches across waters where no ships currently struggle against elements that would test their construction and seamanship, to limits that separate successful passage from catastrophic failure. Yet the light continues its patient rotation regardless of immediate utility, maintained through devotion that recognizes responsibility for providing aid that may be needed without warning to vessels that depend upon coastal infrastructure for survival during emergencies that develop too rapidly for advance preparation or alternative arrangements that might substitute for services that lighthouse keepers provide through dedication that operates independently of personal convenience or individual preference. Outside, the wind shifts slightly, carrying new harmonics that speak of atmospheric pressure, changes that affect storm development according to meteorological principles that connect local weather conditions to global circulation patterns that distribute energy across planetary surfaces through mechanisms too complex for complete human understanding, yet accessible to practical prediction by those who learn to read signs that nature provides for guidance of activities that require coordination between human planning and natural forces that operate according to schedules indifferent to human convenience, yet predictable enough to support navigation and agriculture that depend upon temporal coordination for their successful completion. And as the storm settles for a brief breath, Elias feels a change in the night, faint, nameless, yet impossible to ignore. The apprentice years return to him in fragments of sensation that resist the linear order that memory usually imposes upon past experience, arriving instead as atmospheric impressions that recreate emotional texture more precisely than chronological narrative could achieve. 27 years old, when he first climbed these stairs behind Keeper Matthias Dunlap, whose 78 years had weathered into something approaching geological permanence, Elias had carried expectations about lighthouse duty that bore no resemblance to the reality that awaited him within walls that transformed human time into something approaching eternal duration through repetition, that revealed sacred dimensions hidden within activities that appeared merely functional to observers who had never experienced their contemplative depths. Old Dunlap had spoken little during those initial weeks, when winter storms tested the apprentice's capacity for isolation that previous experience had not prepared him to endure, despite rural upbringing that had accustomed him to solitude, measured in hours rather than months. The keeper's silence had seemed hostile, until understanding revealed it as protection against premature intimacy that required seasonal seasoning before emotional boundaries could safely accommodate the kind of mutual dependence that lighthouse service demanded from men whose survival depended upon cooperative maintenance of systems too complex for individual operation, despite geographical isolation that placed repair and emergency response beyond reach of outside assistance. Time moves differently here, Dunlap had finally explained during a February blizzard that lasted 6 days while they shared provisions calculated for normal consumption periods, their conversations developing depth that emergency cooperation had revealed as compatible rather than merely convenient. The lighthouse teaches patience that cities destroy through constant stimulation that prevents consciousness from settling into rhythms that connect human awareness to natural cycles that operate according to principles too vast for immediate comprehension, yet intimate enough to be felt through daily attention to details that seem insignificant until accumulated observation reveals their participation in patterns that encompass both cosmic and personal dimensions of existence. The old keeper's death 3 years later had transferred responsibility to hands that still trembled with uncertainty about procedures that required confidence earned through seasons of practice, with mechanisms that forgave no errors while demanding perfection, that approached spiritual discipline in its requirements for sustained attention and emotional stability. Dunlap's final illness had progressed with dignity that taught lessons about acceptance that formal education had never addressed. His withdrawal from active duty, proceeding through stages that ensured operational continuity while acknowledging human limitations that made succession inevitable, despite personal preferences that favored permanence over change. Alone for the first time with complete responsibility for light that connected this tower to maritime safety throughout the region. Elias had discovered how isolation amplified both fear and wonder until consciousness oscillated between anxiety about failure and awe about participation in activities that served purposes larger than individual understanding could encompass completely. The mechanisms that had seemed simple under guidance revealed complexities that required months of experimentation before developing intuitive understanding that allowed confident operation despite technical challenges that manual instruction could describe, but not adequately prepare apprentice hands to address through practical application under demanding conditions. Sarah had entered his life during that vulnerable period when competence remained uncertain and loneliness had intensified beyond comfortable management through solitary pursuits that occupied mind and hands without addressing emotional needs that Lighthouse duty both created and denied through geographical isolation that prevented normal social relationships while demanding human presence for mechanical operations that required constant attention despite their repetitive character. Her visits to the lighthouse had begun as charitable obligations that connected church activities to community members whose service placed them beyond normal social circulation. Her presence transforming functional spaces into environments where conversation could develop beyond professional topics, into personal territories that revealed compatibility that neither had anticipated during interactions that formal duty had made possible. Their courtship had proceeded with dignity appropriate to circumstances that required patience for relationships that developed under constraints imposed by duty schedules that limited availability while providing time for careful evaluation of compatibility. That hasty romance might obscure through excitement that prevented realistic assessment of long-term prospects for happiness that required more substantial foundation than physical attraction or social convenience could provide reliably. Her understanding of lighthouse requirements had grown through exposure that revealed both challenges and rewards that accompanied service to purposes that demanded sacrifice of conventional pleasures while offering satisfactions that domestic life rarely achieved through participation in activities whose significance extended beyond personal benefit to encompass community welfare. The consumption that claimed her life had progressed with cruel patience that allowed hope to persist despite medical opinion, that offered little encouragement for recovery from disease that claimed healthy young women with regularity that made optimism appear naive, despite natural human tendency to believe that love could overcome obstacles that appeared temporary rather than final, according to perspective that lacked sufficient experience with mortality to recognize inevitability, despite emotional investment that made acceptance feel like betrayal of promises that circumstance had made impossible to fulfill. Christmas Eve, 31 years ago, had provided setting for their final conversation, conducted in the lighthouse parlor, where warmth from the oil stove could not penetrate the chill that fever had created within her body despite woolen blankets that provided external comfort without addressing internal combat. That consumption was winning through systematic destruction of tissue that medical science could observe, but not prevent through treatments that offered palliative care rather than curative intervention. Her voice had carried musical qualities despite weakening that made speech require effort, that healthy people performed without conscious attention, to mechanics that respiratory disease transformed into laborious processes, that exhausted energy needed for basic survival functions. "Promise me," she had whispered with breath that barely moved air enough to carry sound across space that separated bed from chair, where he maintained vigil that had lasted 3 weeks, while hoping for improvement, that medical opinion considered impossible. Despite prayer and devotion that seemed adequate to overcome obstacles that appeared surmountable through sufficient determination and divine intervention that faith suggested should respond to needs that served love rather than selfish ambition. "Promise that you will not surrender hope when I am gone, that you will continue to tend the light not from duty alone, but from understanding that service to others honors what we have shared, even when sharing becomes impossible through circumstances that neither will nor love can overcome." The promise had been given without hesitation, despite prescient understanding that fulfillment would require strength, that grief might not permit, when loss transformed theoretical commitment into daily practical application, that demanded emotional resources depleted by mourning, that operated according to schedules unrelated to professional obligations, that required consistent performance, regardless of personal capacity, for meeting standards that Lighthouse service imposed, without accommodation for individual circumstances that might affect quality of attention, that navigation aid demanded for reliable operation. Her death had occurred at dawn on December 26th, timing that made Christmas carry associations that connected celebration to loss through proximity, that made seasonal observance impossible to separate from memories that joy intensified rather than diminished through contrast, that emphasized absence more powerfully than presence could be felt when grief made every sensation carry weight that normal emotional response could not support, without structural damage to psychological foundations that required rebuilding through processes that demanded years rather than months for completion, that allowed normal function to resume without constant awareness of inadequacy, that accompanied attempts to perform familiar activities with emotional capacity reduced by percentage, that made every task require extra effort. The tower around him holds memories that walls have absorbed through decades of human presence, that has left traces more permanent than physical modifications could achieve. Emotional residue that affects atmospheric quality in ways that sensitive perception can detect despite inability to describe phenomena that operate beyond normal sensory range, yet influence mood and understanding through mechanisms that connect consciousness to environmental conditions, through pathways that scientific analysis has not yet mapped adequately for practical application. The stone itself seems to remember conversations that echoed through spiral stairways during winters, when isolation had been shared rather than endured in solitude, that made every sound carry significance beyond its immediate practical function. Tonight, the mechanisms that regulate light rotation operate with sounds that suggest respiratory patterns more than mechanical function, brass gears meshing with rhythm that resembles heartbeat, slowed to accommodate extended cycles that measure time in periods longer than human pulse can sustain without conscious effort to synchronize biological rhythms with mechanical precision that operates independently of physiological demands, yet creates acoustic environment that unconscious awareness interprets as evidence of life force that pervades material structures through processes that animate matter without requiring biological organization for manifestation of characteristics that normally distinguish living from inanimate phenomena. The wind that presses against tower walls creates harmonic frequencies that transform stone into musical instrument, whose voice carries notes that speak of geological time intersecting with atmospheric events that produce temporary compositions, whose beauty derives from chance relationships between permanent structures and transient forces that create acoustic effects too complex for reproduction through human engineering, yet sufficiently reliable for repeated experience by those whose circumstances provide opportunity for extended observation of phenomena that require sustained attention for recognition of patterns that casual encounter would dismiss as random noise rather than organized expression of natural principles that operate according to laws that encompass both physical and aesthetic dimensions of existence. Heat from the oil flame creates convection currents that distribute warmth through spaces designed to maintain working temperatures despite external conditions that would otherwise make habitation impossible during months when survival depends upon artificial heat sources that require constant attention for safe operation under circumstances where neglect could result in fire that would destroy structures, whose replacement would require resources and expertise that geographical isolation makes practically impossible to obtain within timeframes that emergency situations would permit for solutions that preserve both human life and institutional function. Cold penetrates stone through thermal conduction that operates according to physical laws indifferent to human comfort, yet predictable enough to allow defensive measures that minimize heat loss while preserving essential warmth for operations that require manual dexterity, that low temperatures would compromise beyond levels that permit reliable performance of tasks, whose successful completion determines whether navigation aids function according to specifications that mariners depend upon for guidance through waters, where miscalculation results in destruction that claims lives and vessels without providing opportunity for correction of errors that proved fatal because environmental conditions prevented accurate assessment of position relative to hazards that proper lighthouse operation would have revealed in time for course correction. The sea beyond the windows moves with power that makes human engineering appear fragile. Despite evidence of lighthouse survival through countless storms that have tested structural integrity while proving design excellence that allows tower to withstand forces that destroy less carefully constructed buildings through wind pressure and wave action, that combine to create stress loads that exceed safety margins incorporated into construction, that lacks sufficient understanding of extreme conditions that North Atlantic weather can produce when atmospheric and oceanic systems interact, according to patterns that generate forces whose magnitude surpasses normal planning parameters. Snow falls with increased intensity that reduces visibility beyond distances, that makes shoreline features indistinguishable from atmospheric conditions that transform familiar landscape into abstract composition, where reference points disappear beneath white uniformity that eliminates visual cues that normal navigation depends upon for accurate position determination. The effect creates illusion of suspension within cloud that possesses no boundaries, environment where up and down become arbitrary designations rather than absolute directions that provide orientation for movement through space, that has lost dimensional characteristics that conscious awareness requires for confident interaction with physical reality. Ice forms on window surfaces with crystalline patterns that create temporary art through processes that operate according to molecular behavior that connects microscopic organization to macroscopic visual effects that please aesthetic sense while demonstrating natural principles that govern phase transitions between liquid and solid states of matter that respond to temperature changes according to laws that encompass both thermodynamic efficiency and geometric beauty in expressions of order that suggest intelligence operating within natural processes despite absence of conscious intention that human observers can detect through investigation methods currently available for analysis of phenomena that exceed explanatory frameworks that scientific understanding has developed for description of complexity that appears designed, yet emerges through mechanisms that operate without apparent design purpose. Far across water that reflects no light beneath clouds that block celestial illumination. Something moves with purpose that distinguishes it from wave action and atmospheric disturbance. Presence that catches attention despite distance. That makes identification impossible through visual observation, that relies upon contrast between object and background, that weather conditions have eliminated through uniformity, that makes detection dependent upon movement patterns that suggest intelligence rather than natural phenomena, that operate according to predictable physical principles rather than conscious intention, that guides action towards specific goals that require planning and execution, that random forces cannot achieve through chance combination of favorable circumstances. The lens mechanism requires adjustment that maintains optimal focus for light projection, that serves navigation purposes through beam characteristics that depend upon precise alignment between lamp position and optical surfaces that concentrate illumination according to geometric relationships that determine both intensity and directional accuracy of signals that guide ships through hazardous waters where miscalculation results in disaster. That lighthouse operation exists to prevent through reliable performance that demands constant attention from keepers whose dedication ensures community safety through service that operates beyond public awareness, yet provides essential protection that coastal commerce depends upon for safe passage between ports that serve economic needs requiring maritime transportation. Despite natural hazards that make navigation dangerous under optimal conditions and potentially fatal when weather conditions create additional challenges that proper lighthouse maintenance can minimize through provision of accurate reference points for position determination. And as the snow thickens into a white veil swallowing sea and sky alike, Elias senses that the night has begun to gather itself, as if preparing to reveal something long concealed. The presence that moves across the water between waves of snow and wind resolves itself into certainty through patient observation that distinguishes purposeful motion from chaotic movement of elements that respond to atmospheric pressure according to principles that create apparent organization within natural systems that operate without conscious intention. A light, faint and inconsistent, appears and disappears behind veils of precipitation that make distance impossible to judge accurately, yet its behavior suggests human origin rather than phosphorescent phenomena that sometimes create luminous displays in waters where organic matter concentrates, according to current patterns that deposit marine life in configurations that produce optical effects resembling artificial illumination despite entirely natural causation. Elias adjusts the lighthouse beam with movements that have become unconscious through repetition that spans decades of similar nights when atmospheric conditions required modifications to standard operating procedures that accommodate weather patterns whose effects on light transmission demand practical responses based upon experience rather than theoretical knowledge about optical physics, that explains phenomena without providing guidance for field applications that serve navigation needs under circumstances that textbook analysis cannot adequately address through abstract principles divorced from environmental realities that affect equipment performance. The mysterious light maintains irregular pattern that suggests struggle against forces that impede progress while preventing clear identification of vessel type or crew circumstances that might require assistance. Despite obvious difficulties that small craft experience when attempting passage through waters where larger ships exercise caution during optimal conditions while avoiding transit entirely, when storm warnings indicate hazardous sea states that exceed safety parameters for vessels whose design specifications assume moderate weather rather than extreme conditions that transform routine navigation into survival challenges that test both equipment and human endurance beyond normal operational limits. Through brass telescope that extends visual range despite atmospheric interference that reduces effective observation distance to fractions of normal capabilities, he observes what appears to be single-handed sailing craft, whose operator maintains steerage despite wind conditions that would challenge experienced crews aboard larger vessels equipped with multiple sail configurations that allow adjustment for varying atmospheric pressures that affect vessel stability through force vectors that operate according to aerodynamic principles that small boats cannot manipulate effectively when understaffed or when equipment limitations prevent optimal response to changing conditions that demand immediate tactical adjustments for safe operation. Memory supplies images of winter storms when ships appeared without warning from behind weather fronts that concealed their approach, until proximity made lighthouse assistance crucial for navigation, that depended upon accurate bearing information that only coastal beacons could provide when visibility conditions eliminated celestial and terrestrial reference points that normal navigation relied upon for position determination, that enabled course corrections necessary for safe passage through waters where bottom conditions and current patterns created hazards that charts could indicate but actual observation would reveal with precision required for successful completion of voyages that storm conditions transformed from routine passages into tests of seamanship that separated competent from inadequate preparation for emergencies that developed without sufficient warning for alternative planning. The storm reaches intensity that transforms atmospheric pressure into physical force, that makes lighthouse structure vibrate with harmonics that connect architectural engineering to musical composition, through resonant frequencies that depend upon material properties and geometric relationships that create acoustic effects whose beauty emerges from same mathematical principles that govern structural stability under stress conditions, that test design margins through loads that exceed normal parameters while remaining within safety factors that ensure survival of buildings whose function requires continued operation despite environmental challenges that would shut down facilities whose purpose allows temporary closure without consequences that extend beyond economic inconvenience. Wind pressure against glass surfaces creates optical distortions that affect light transmission through mechanisms that demonstrate how atmospheric conditions influence electromagnetic radiation, according to physical laws that operate regardless of human understanding or practical needs that require reliable performance from equipment whose function depends upon consistent behavior, despite environmental variables that introduce complications requiring constant adjustment for optimal results, that serve navigation purposes through provision of accurate signals that guide vessels through hazardous waters where miscalculation results in consequences, that lighthouse maintenance exists to prevent through dedication that operates beyond normal working schedules. Ice accumulation on external mechanisms requires removal that restores functional capacity to systems whose precision tolerances cannot accommodate interference from crystalline deposits that form according to temperature gradients and moisture content that combine to create barriers that impede mechanical operation, while demonstrating natural processes that operate without regard for human convenience, yet follow predictable patterns that allow preventive measures for those who understand atmospheric conditions sufficiently to anticipate problems before they progress beyond possibility of correction through standard maintenance procedures that lighthouse service demands for reliable operation under all weather conditions. The beam that sweeps across turbulent water illuminates scenes of natural violence that speak of forces that dwarf human engineering despite structural achievements that enable survival within environments that would otherwise prove fatal to consciousness, that requires protection from elements whose power operates according to scales that make individual existence appear insignificant, except when viewed from perspectives that recognize how human dedication serves purposes that connect personal effort to cosmic order through activities that honor divine creativity while meeting practical needs, that ensure community welfare across generations, that benefit from infrastructure, that operates through individual commitment to excellence that transcends personal advantage. Waves break against rocks with percussion that creates acoustic environment where natural and artificial sounds combine to produce symphonic effects that demonstrate how human construction participates in geological processes that shape coastlines through erosion and deposition, that operate according to temporal scales that encompass both immediate storm effects and long-term geological change that connects present conditions to prehistoric formations that provide foundation for current landscape features that determine harbor configurations and navigation hazards that lighthouse placement must address through strategic positioning that maximizes utility while minimizing vulnerability to natural forces that threaten structures whose survival depends upon engineering excellence that anticipates extreme conditions. The oil flame requires adjustment that maintains optimal burn characteristics despite air pressure variations that affect combustion efficiency through mechanisms that connect atmospheric physics to chemical processes that convert fuel into light, according to principles that lighthouse operation depends upon for reliable illumination that serves maritime safety through consistent performance. Regardless of weather conditions that influence equipment behavior while demanding human attention, that ensures proper function through procedures that transform routine maintenance into spiritual discipline, that connects individual dedication to community service through work that honors both practical necessity and transcendent purpose. Through telescope observation that penetrates snow curtains during brief moments when atmospheric conditions permit extended visibility. The mysterious craft appears to be making progress toward shoreline despite obvious difficulties that single-handed navigation presents when weather conditions exceed normal operating parameters for vessels whose size and equipment limitations prevent optimal response to atmospheric pressures that larger ships accommodate through crew resources and mechanical advantages that small boats cannot deploy effectively when undermanned or when survival demands constant attention to basic seamanship. That leaves no opportunity for tactical sophistication that storm navigation requires for safe completion under challenging circumstances. The lighthouse lens assembly operates with mechanical precision that transforms human effort into regulated motion, that serves navigation through timing relationships, that connect individual lighthouse beacons to comprehensive coastal aid systems, that provide overlapping coverage for vessels that depend upon multiple reference points for accurate position determination during storms when single sources of information cannot provide sufficient data for confident navigation through waters where bottom conditions and current patterns create hazards that require precise knowledge of vessel location. Relative to known dangers that proper lighthouse maintenance reveals through signals whose reliability enables safe passage for maritime commerce, that connects coastal communities to broader economic networks. Dawn approaches through atmospheric conditions that transform sunrise into gradual illumination, that emerges through layers of cloud and precipitation, that filter light according to optical principles, that create visual effects, whose beauty derives from same physical laws that govern lighthouse operation through mechanisms that focus and direct artificial illumination for practical purposes that serve human needs, while demonstrating natural phenomena that inspire aesthetic appreciation despite entirely utilitarian origins, that connect functional engineering to cosmic harmony through mathematical relationships that encompass both technical efficiency and spiritual significance in expressions of order that suggest divine intelligence operating through natural processes. The mysterious vessel disappears behind wave formations that conceal small craft, despite continued observation through instruments that extend visual capability beyond normal human limits. Its fate unknown, yet presence confirmed through extended watching that revealed human determination to continue passage. Despite conditions that prudent seamanship would avoid through alternative planning that delayed departure until weather improvements permitted safer transit through waters where storm conditions create survival challenges that test both equipment and operator skill beyond levels that routine navigation demands for successful completion of voyages that normal circumstances render manageable through standard procedures and adequate preparation. Christmas morning breaks across waters that reflect dawn light through atmospheric conditions that transform familiar seascape into ethereal composition where boundaries between sea and sky dissolve through optical effects that demonstrate how environmental conditions affect human perception while revealing natural beauty that emerges from same forces that create navigation hazards requiring lighthouse guidance for safe passage through waters where visual reference points disappear beneath weather conditions that make position determination dependent upon artificial aids whose reliability demands constant human attention. Despite isolation that separates keepers from social interaction, that normally provides emotional support for activities that serve community welfare. The lighthouse beam continues its patient rotation across waters that have calmed slightly as atmospheric pressure stabilizes toward conditions that permit safer navigation while maintaining caution appropriate for season when storm development remains possible. Despite temporary improvements that encourage maritime activity without eliminating dangers that North Atlantic winter presents, to vessels whose operators must balance commercial necessity against safety considerations that prudent seamanship demands for protection of lives and equipment, whose value transcends immediate economic calculation to encompass human relationships and community continuity, that maritime disasters threaten through loss of personnel whose skills and knowledge represent irreplaceable cultural resources. Standing before mechanisms that operate with reliability that human consistency rarely achieves, Elias contemplates how individual dedication serves purposes that extend beyond personal satisfaction to connect human effort to cosmic order. Through activities that honor divine creativity while meeting practical needs that ensure community survival and cultural continuity across generations that depend upon infrastructure that operates through individual commitment to excellence that transcends immediate reward, while providing satisfaction that comes from participation in activities whose significance extends beyond temporal limitations to encompass eternal purposes that justify temporary sacrifice for permanent achievement that serves beauty and truth through human cooperation with natural forces. The promise made to Sarah 31 years ago has been fulfilled through daily attention to responsibilities that honor her memory, while serving purposes that she understood despite physical separation that death imposed without eliminating spiritual connection that operates through mechanisms that transcend biological existence, to encompass forms of communication that consciousness maintains across boundaries that rational explanation cannot adequately describe. Yet emotional experience confirms through evidence that accumulates beyond possibility of dismissal as mere imagination or wishful thinking that lacks foundation in actual phenomena that affect human behavior through pathways that scientific analysis has not yet mapped for practical application. And as Christmas morning breaks over the frozen Atlantic, the beam of the lighthouse sweeps across the whitening sea, steady, patient, unchanged, guiding a world that will never know the man who kept its fire alive through the longest night.